Today's episode is brought to you by Alexandra Park BJJ. Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu is a full contact martial art and combat sport that was developed in Brazil in the 20th century. With roots in Judo and Japanese Jiu-Jitsu, has been developed and refined into a unique grappling art with the aim to allow a smaller and weaker individual to beat a bigger and stronger opponent with the application of proper technique. Based in Muswell Hill, North London, Alexandra Park BJJ's classes are designed so that you can develop your fitness levels, balance, coordination and flexibility in a no-pressure environment, and to provide the opportunity to start a new sport at a reasonable price. At Alexandra Park BJJ, we aim to be inclusive so that everyone can benefit from this incredible art, not just the athletic or ultra-competitive. To book your free class, head over to alexandraparkbjj.co.uk or email inquiries at alexandraparkbjj.co.uk.
Welcome to Audiobookish, an audiobook review and discussion podcast looking at audiobooks both big and small, as well as radio plays, narrative podcasts, anything audiobook-ish. This podcast may contain spoilers, rants, curse words, mispronunciations of names and places, and more.
Hello everyone, you are listening to Audiobookish, an audiobook review and discussion podcast. My name is Fahed Rahman and I'm joined by Poppy Knight.
Hello.
And today we are going to be reviewing The Island of Missing Trees by Elif Shafak. Do you want to read out the blurb for this one?
Yes, definitely. So, two teenagers, a Greek Cypriot and a Turkish Cypriot, meet at a taverna on the island they both call home. The taverna is the only place that Kostas and Defne can meet in secret, hidden beneath the blackened beams from which hang garlands of garlic and chilli peppers, creeping honeysuckle, and in the centre, growing through a cavity in the roof, a fig tree. The fig tree witnesses their hushed, happy meetings, their silent, surreptitious departures. The fig tree is there too when war breaks out, when the capital is reduced to ashes and rubble, when the teenagers vanish. Decades later, Kostas returns a botanist looking for native species, looking, really, for Daphne. The two lovers return to the taverna to take a clipping from the fig tree and smuggle it into their suitcase bound for London. Years later, the fig tree in the garden is their daughter Ada's only knowledge of a home she has never visited, as she seeks to untangle years of secrets and silence and find her place in the world. Shortlisted for the Women's Prize for Fiction 2022, shortlisted for the Costa Novel Award 2021.
And I'll read out Elif's bio. Elif Shafak is a British-Turkish novelist, political scientist and commentator. The most widely read female author in Turkey, her novels have been translated into over 50 languages worldwide. Shafak's fiction is both steeped in Anatolian culture and profoundly modern in questioning of tradition and orthodoxy. She's been praised for marrying mysticism and myth with contemporary issues around gender and identity, a result of her academic expertise in political science and gender studies. Shafak's breakthrough came through in 2006 when The Bastard of Istanbul was longlisted for the Orange Prize for Women's Fiction. 7 years later, Honor was shortlisted for the same award. Her novels include The 40 Rules of Love and The Architect's Apprentice, while her latest book, 10 minutes, 38 seconds in this strange world, was described by the Financial Times as a novel that gives a voice to the invisible, untouchable, the abused and the damaged, weaving their painful songs into a thing of beauty. And this audiobook was narrated by Daphne, Kouma and Amira Ghazalla. So Poppy, this was your pick. Can you just say how you came across it and why you wanted to discuss it?
Yeah, so I came across it literally just because I was browsing for the next thing that I wanted to listen to, and the cover grabbed me. It was beautiful cover that I saw. It's got like a blue background. It's got a fig tree growing in a lovely, we've discussed before, I don't know my art terms, but sort of like etched out kind of line style. Beautiful colours of this fig tree, and it grabbed me. And then I listened to the sample, and it's Amira Ghazalla's narration, and her voice is just incredible. For me, she could narrate absolutely anything and I would listen to it. So yeah, that really grabbed me. And then I wanted to talk about it because the last time we spoke, I was a good amount through it and I was loving it so much that I just knew I would want to gush about it for an entire episode. And I definitely do. It has held up to that. So yeah.
Cool. This book wasn't necessarily what I was expecting it to be. I've got like a certain like expectations of what, even though I've never read any other books, I had certain expectations of what this book was going to be.
Okay, so what did you expect?
Okay, so while I was at university, there were certain female friends of mine would be like reading her books, and I just have like a prejudice based on kind of like what their tastes usually would include. So it's kind of like, I actually kind of sort of funny aside, a girl that I was like fairly attracted to gave me one of her books as like a present. And we subsequently didn't go out, so I just kind of maybe had a little bit of prejudice against her.
Yeah.
Anyway, so I'm not reading any books by that author. So yeah, so but it's it was a bit of a nice surprise, really.
Good.
Do you want to like kind of start off with your initial thoughts? Kind of you kind of mentioned listening to the preview and being drawn in by the narration. So do you want to kind of maybe take it from there?
Sure, of course, definitely. So I also think that it would probably be a bit of a surprise to a lot of our listeners what it's like, because I'm not sure that I say this a lot, I'm not sure that blurb properly captures the story. I think, you know, it makes it seem, I think, more like a romance book than it is. It's not a romance book. Like you could, a bit like The Mermaid of Black Conch has, you could like add a, subtitle of a love story on the end of it, but that doesn't make, just like The Mermaid of Black Conch, that doesn't make it a romance. It is a story that's about a situation, that's about people, that's about history, culture, all sorts of stuff that happens to have a very strong relationship within it, is what I think. And so, yeah, if you're the sort of person that doesn't like romance novels and you're starting to be put off by that, please don't be, because while I'm sure people who do love romance novels can also love it, that's not the vibe, it's got a lot of other stuff going on. It's just also got a very strong relationship between two people, as well as a lot of really strong familial relationships and stuff like that make it great. So that's sort of as an overview thing. And then, talking about the narration that really pulled me in. So Amira Ghazalla voices the fig tree, and the way the book's structured is that you have fig tree chapters throughout. And we'd sort of talked on the last episode, do go back and listen to that if you haven't already. I briefly mentioned how it has this sort of backwards step away from humanity to then comment on humanity. It's a personified tree, and it is a really, really interesting perspective to have throughout. And a lot of the time she's talking quite abstractly, but a lot of the time she's talking directly about the characters and the people in her life. She talks a lot about different animals and species, and there's very definitely all that kind of stuff wound in there that I thought was just fabulous and really, really wonderful. And she herself, the fig tree, is a fascinating, fascinating character. She is... she's proud and she's jealous and she's passionate and she laughs at people making stupid claims, and she's maternal in some ways and kind of, sexual in others with her passions, and she's just fantastic, a real personality, a proper identity to this fig tree. And she talks about the identities of other types of trees, and I mean, that bit in itself was fascinating enough. And she kind of talks about if you were to ask a carob tree for their opinion, they tell a completely different story. And I was like, can the author please write that? I would love like a whole entire mini series that's just like different trees and their own opinions of each other and of the animals around them and of the places that they live in. It was just wonderful. It was a wonderful character in the way it was written, and such a wonderful character in the way it's performed. Yeah, Amira Ghazalla's voice is fantastic, and that was really what pulled me into it. So then, amid that, what you have is Daphne Kouma is narrating the other parts, and they are again split in two. Into Ada, the child of Kostas and Defne. And she was born in London, brought up in London. She's kind of at high school at this point, and you hear some of her story, and you have her kind of present day, and you have her relationship with her father in present day, and her mother has passed. We do learn that quite soon, so it's not a huge spoiler. And, you know, we talk about her dealing with that. And then also you have her Aunt Miriam comes over from Cyprus, and you have a whole plot line with, you know, kind of those three characters in the present, shall we say. And then you also have flashbacks to Kostas and Defne when they were young children, well, teens, in Cyprus, and then the decades later that the blurb talks about when they reunite. And as much as I think Amira Ghazalla's voice is just incredible, and that kind of shines above for me, I don't in any way want to discredit Daphne Kouma's narration, because it is phenomenal. And kind of the fig tree sections, and I think this very much suits the character, are very much just kind of her voice, right? Whereas Daphne Kouma has to do the voices of, you know, all the named characters that I've mentioned, as well as many other characters, and also do young versions and old versions of those characters, which I thought she did. Yeah, an amazing distinction between those, which was just fantastic. So while I fell in love with Amira's voice, I am in awe of how well Daphne performs the rest of it. And yeah, I mean, this book I think is definitely one to be listened to for the fact of how phenomenal those, different narrations are. I'm aware I've blabbed for a long time now, so I'm going to let you get a word in.
Yes, I mean, I just wanted to kind of take you up on the point about Daphne having to do both old and young versions of the voice. Mm-hmm. That's not something I'd actually considered before, and that is probably quite a challenging thing as a performer to prepare for, I imagine.
Yeah, I bet.
So yeah, I mean, I just wanted to also take you up on a couple of other points. So I've got a slight issue with her performance of like Ada, because I grew up in North London. I knew a lot of like Greek Cypriot and Turkish Cypriot girls, and like, for me, from the area of North London I was growing up, and the Greek and Turkish Cypriot girls I knew didn't really sound like Ada.
Right.
I don't think she quite nailed that accent. She just, to me, sounded like not necessarily an English girl, but I didn't kind of really get like that sense of like ethnicity from her that I'd kind of like expect from someone who grew up in those communities. But I think maybe part of that could be explained away with the fact that she doesn't really speak Greek or Turkish at home. So I think that maybe there is a little bit of that in there. Again, I think the character of the fig. So like this book reminded me of like different graphic novels I've actually read. Like starting off with like the fig tree, that kind of like her perspective kind of reminded me of like the Sandman, kind of this non-human character kind of commentating and remarking on human affairs, kind of like a mix between like Sandman and Swamp Thing, where you've got this kind of like plant perspective on the cycles of time. I think like time is a really important theme that runs through the book, kind of generational trauma. So I think that's that's kind of mentioned again, how trees have memories that they can pass on to their seeds and kind of give them kind of different attributes. And I think that's mirrored in the like generational trauma of some of the human characters that basically went through a really damaging civil war, which kind of also reminded me of Mouse, which is a really famous graphic novel about the Holocaust and how the trauma that the survivors of an actual event can kind of like how they can pass that on. So you can you have these situations where people have survived this really traumatic event, but the children have to survive the survivors in some cases. And there's kind of an interesting pull between others' parents about how they should approach it. Like one of them is very much like, we can't let her know anything about this, because like if she knows, then she'll know and she can't unknow it. Where like the other parent is more like, look, she's going to find out, and it's not worth like hiding it from her. So it's kind of that push pull in there as well. But yeah, I mean, I kind of agree with you. Like the Ghazali's performance was really remarkable. You can kind of like, I'm not too sure how old she is, but you really get a sense of like, not necessarily wisdom, but this is someone who's gone through things. Kind of that really kind of comes across in her, kind of the way she kind of enunciates certain words.
Yeah. No, definitely. And I'm going to do back on you what you did to me and go back through a few things. But I'll go backwards on that, because I think my one criticism of the audiobook specifically is that I'm not sure that it was managed very well how sometimes Amira will drop off at the end of sentences. And go quite low, and whether that was kind of, during recording or during kind of processing in post or whatever, I did find that quite a lot of her, not a lot, a decent number across a, 12-hour book or whatever, were clipped so much that I couldn't really tell what she'd said.
Oh, okay.
And I kind of did have to go and, because I was listening on BorrowBox and I went and got the ebook on BorrowBox as well, and I did go and check what some of the words were. So yeah, unfortunately, I do think that is a criticism of the audiobook, and I wouldn't want to put it against Amira, because I think it was really nice how she went down, but there were definite points where it disappeared. The words just genuinely disappeared, like kind of full words and stuff like that.
I didn't encounter that, so I listened to this on Zigzag, and I can't. Yeah, I don't remember any instances where I struggled to hear what she was saying. The other thing I should probably preface my review. So I listened to a lot of this, the first half of this book on my trip to Edinburgh, where I was going on holiday, and I planned that trip quite badly. So I arrived in Edinburgh around 2 a.m. in the morning. So, and I was just like listening to the book while I was walking around. So, and I'm pretty sure I started hallucinating at some point just due to time. So maybe kind of like those were the sections where the audio,
where it slipped out a little bit. Yeah.
Dropped out a little bit, but yeah.
And it was very much like, it was a few times, and it was because I was very much the opposite in that I was paying a lot of attention to it. But yeah, so anyway, very slight criticism, but yeah, it was a shame in what is otherwise, I think, such a phenomenal audiobook that I would very much recommend everyone listens to rather than reads. It was a little bit of a shame that I think some of those things got lost. So going back on what you're saying about the generational stuff and the keeping her distance from her heritage, and that is very much, something that's really strong in Ada's sections, and potentially that is why that accent choice was maybe representing that, but it's really not something that I know anything about at all. But yeah, that is certainly a important thing, that she does feel very detached from Cyprus and wants to feel more connected to it, and doesn't quite understand why not. And then as we learn throughout the book, because of the civil war in Cyprus, because of the atrocities that people either experienced or knew about and felt connected to, so kind of Daphne experiencing and Kostas being aware of and feeling the guilt of not being there to experience them, all these sorts of things, you sort of begin to understand why they have closed her off from it, and why it's not necessarily as simple as she might think, when she's like, why won't my parents talk about Cyprus? Which is really interesting. And then the other thing I wanted to comment on what you'd said was about things that the fig tree narration reminds you of. And one example that I hope you'll agree with me on is it made me think of Freya in Guthrum. It was very, very similar of, as you say, an inhuman voice commenting on it, and the fact that some of it was directly on the action and some things took you away and talked about the mythology or whatever as a kind of separate thing, but that tonally matched where we're up to in the story and stuff like that. So yeah, if you listen to Guthrum on our recommendation and enjoyed it, then and enjoyed that part of it as well, then that's something that you'll love in this book too.
Yeah. So, I mean, just going back to kind of like my experience with kind of Cypriot, it's one of those things where like I grew up with a lot of, especially kind of Greek Cypriot people. I went to like primary school, secondary school with them. I never actually questioned why there was like a Cypriot community in London. And this is like a part of, I guess, British history that I knew absolutely nothing about. So that was also really is really kind of like a good realization for me. It's like, I grew up, with these people. I don't really know what their story is. And, when you're listening to books, you always kind of bring your own personal kind of baggage to it. And, the other question that, Ada's got about her kind of like heritage, kind of like, for me, I didn't really ask my parents a lot of questions about, well, like, why did they move to England and stuff like that. But now my nephews and nieces are kind of asking those questions. And like, unfortunately, a lot of them, both my mum and dad have passed away. A lot of my aunties, uncles from that generation have gone. And because like my generation, well, I can't say my generation, me personally, I wasn't curious about that stuff. I haven't got answers to give them. And I think that's another thing that kind of like this book pulls at slightly as well, is just because in terms of like knowledge and stories, whose decision is it for you to like have those stories, have access to that knowledge or not? Because that's, another thing that kind of flows through the book is, what's Ada's mum called again?
Daphne.
Yeah, Daphne. One of the things that she does as a job is kind of like go into the field to recover bodies and kind of like try and find out where people are buried. And I found that was kind of like quite an interesting, like big part of her life was finding out and giving back people control of their loved ones' bodies. But yet she didn't want to give that same sort of like information to a daughter. And it's kind of like that for me is kind of pulling in like slightly different directions that kind of it made me think a lot about why was I so curious about, firstly, my own personal history, but also kind of like people that I grew up with as well. I think that's kind of like interesting too.
Oh, yeah, definitely. No, really interesting. And so, the sections where Daphne is now working to find the bodies of the people that were killed during the Civil War is obviously extremely morbid and sad, but still a very fascinating part. And for me, it was really interesting because in drama in high school, we did a project about the disappeared, which was a similar thing in Argentina where a lot of people went missing.
Yeah.
And, their bodies weren't recovered / their bodies were only very later recovered and things like that. And that had really stuck with me from doing that back then. And so when I heard this, that it really brought that back to the forefront. And it's also connects with that idea of things being lost to time. So with what you're saying there about not being able to give those answers, you do feel when you're listening to this, certainly those sections, the kind of decades later sections, that you are running out of time. That soon all the people who know where the bodies are buried will be gone and that kind of thing. And soon it will be too late to give people that piece of comfort. Though the nice part of kind of the widow's tombstones that say, if you find my husband, please bury him with me kind of thing, so it's never too late, of course. But definitely that idea of things being lost to time, and with Daphne being gone in the later sections, that idea that Ada's then lost something she can't get back. So that is, there's running out of people to ask, and that definitely flows through the entire thing. Even with like her school project thing that she has, that is very definitely something that is in there. So I can certainly see why that connects with your personal experience for that bit. And then I had a different, but I guess in some ways similar thing to you, in that I really didn't know much at all about Cyprus's history. But for me, I haven't really met many people from Cyprus at all. I believe there was one girl in a few of my modules at uni who's from Cyprus, but I genuinely haven't met anyone else from Cyprus and really didn't know much about it. I knew vaguely about kind of tensions between Greeks and Turks, but that was the extent of my knowledge, unfortunately, at that point, because it isn't something, despite, as we learn from this book, the extent of the British involvement in it, it's not something that we learn about at all. So, and it really, obviously devastating. I was still very intrigued by it, and I'm really gripped by the way this story told you that island's history.
Yes.
I got really, really emotionally involved in that, I think, and really interested by it. And I was in Waterstones recently and saw a book called The Silence of Scheherazade, by Daphne. And that, when I read the blurb of that, it sounded like it would be quite similar and covering a lot of the same historical context as this book. And it has been praised by Elif Shafak as well. So I haven't listened to it yet, so I can't necessarily recommend it. But that is, I think, one of the things that I'm going to listen to, if not next, then soon, because of how much this made me really interested in that part of the world and that section of its history and stuff like that.
Yeah, I mean, I completely agree. Kind of, it is something that I want to know, actually go out and read a little bit more about the way she, well, I don't think we've actually mentioned how beautifully she writes. She writes, she writes absolutely like beautifully. Those sections where she is talking about the history, and most of that is in the fig tree sections. Those are really difficult sections to kind of get right, because that you don't want to recite history from like, it can be kind of like dry and expositional and just trying to get this information across. But there's so much poetry is the wrong word, but it's really lyrical in the way she kind of approaches it from the tree's point of view. And the tree's always talking about the relationship between the people and animals and nature, and there are like fantastical elements in the dialogue she has. She has conversations with bees and ants and other trees, and I found the way she kind of explains away that history to give, because that context to the story is really, really important. You don't get the emotional heft of when Aunt Miriam visits, or kind of the main romantic relationship, without that historical geopolitical context. So that was important to get in there.
And also the kind of subplot, I guess is one way to describe it, of Yusuf and Yorgos, who run the taverna, and their story is very similar to what you're saying there. It's really entwined with that perspective of the fig tree, and the context is really important for that and for the emotion of it and for what happens. Yeah. And lyrical was the word that I'd used as well, and like figurative, and all the imagery, all the metaphor is fantastic. And I also thought, as well as loving the narration and the way that it was done and loving the writing, I really just enjoyed listening to the words wash over me. And because they were performed really brilliantly. And I've also often thought this, but not actually known how to express it, and been like, I really wish I could identify what actually is it that I'm loving about it. And slight tangent, and please do get back to your points that you want to say, but I recently went to a talk by Philip Pullman, which was very exciting. He was asked the question of how does he write, not in the physical sense of, kind of pen and paper, but how does he come up with the next sentence effectively? And he really quite quickly said that it was all about the rhythm. That's why he can't listen to music while he writes, because he hears the rhythm of the words. And it's like, okay, this sentence went like this, so the next sentence goes dum-de-dum-de-dum-de-dum. De-dum-de-dum-de-dum. And he did a whole section on that, which was fascinating and made me think about this book. And I was like, well, maybe that's why I love listening to the words and the way it's written so much, as well as the content in them, the meaning of them, how lyrical they are, how beautiful they are, how emotive they are, all the imagery. It's also just written in a way that flows and that sounds beautiful. And another reason to listen to it.
Yeah, I think, there is a certain tempo to we keep on referring kind of to the fig tree sections, but I think it's also apparent in especially Ada's sections. A real age is another big theme in this book. It's kind of like Ada's is kind of like suffering from teenaged angst about like certain things, and like there's a little bit on social media in this book. That's a little bit of a theme. I don't think she really teased that out in I don't know how you felt about that
so I didn't really gel with those bits. And I, wouldn't actually go in and gut it out. But if she had written this book without the Ada bits in it, I wouldn't have minded too much. Though the thing I like about the Ada bits is that it allows the Aunt Miriam stuff to come in, which is fantastic. But I didn't fully connect with Ada's character and the stuff that she was going through at school. So maybe just if those bits were removed, then to me, it wouldn't have affected me too much. Because yeah, I didn't really gel with those bits. They took me away a bit. In some ways, a slightly cringe. But what I did like that is kind of entwined with those sections is the idea of a connection between her and the fig tree, which that was really cool. But yeah, no, I agree with you. Those bits, the kind of social media bits and the teen angst bits, weren't the strongest bits of this book. But yeah, still nothing to tell you not to listen to it. It's no way that bad. It's just not the strongest bits of a very strong book.
Yeah. And then, so we've got like the teenage sections. We've got like a slightly older teenage sections, which is kind of like the initial love story. Then we've got like sections focused on like a dad trying to deal with her daughter, a slightly older woman kind of dealing with what could have been and what should have been in like Aunt Mira. And then we've got this ancient character that's got kind of like a much longer view of things. And like the fig trees also suffers from its own traumas as well, but it's got a slightly longer perspective on things as well. It's kind of like, a child that's basically focusing on the very short term, someone who's got a slightly medium term look, kind of like looking ahead and looking a little bit further back. And then you've got the tree, which has got like this kind of generational view as well. So I found that kind of like thing about the way they played with perspectives of time and what things are important and stuff as well was really worked really, really well.
Oh, fully agree. Yeah, definitely.
What other topics have you got kind of like, because I've got a couple of other things that I've like words that I've written down. One of them is kind of like mythology that kind of plays quite a big part in the book, especially in the fig trees section, which is it kind of not analogy, but this kind of references to kind of what's happening either on Cyprus or in relationship between different characters in the book. Do you have any like thoughts on that?
Yeah, no, I really liked that, and sort of both the mythology in kind of traditional sense with like the Greek mythology that's definitely brought in there, and also the kind of, I guess you could call it like the fake mythology, in this idea of these trees and their different personalities and stuff like that. There's a absolutely beautiful section near the end where she basically just lists which trees you should go to for a certain emotional situation. And it is just a list if you want to look at it dryly, but my goodness, is it moving. So the things like that and the symbolism and the metaphor or whatever with the different plant-animal relationships and the kind of dynamics in animal societies and all sorts of stuff like that comes into it is really important as well. And that actually sort of reminds me of one of the things that I did want to talk about was Kostas's relationship with nature. And so he's a botanist and he loves trees, and that very definitely is a connection there. But you learn a lot about him throughout his life, feeling very connected to animals and very empathetic towards them, and really violently upset about cruelty towards them and things like that. And I think that is a really important part of the book. It's something that certainly for me resonated quite closely, as animals are such a big part of my life and kind of, relationships between them and how those kind of moralities work and things like that. And as well, A, as a literal example for that, and B, as just a theme in general, the way his mother didn't share that feeling and kind of, thought he was too sensitive for being upset about things like that. It really did resonate in that way that I think it will for a lot of people, that when people invalidate stuff that's important to you, that really hurts, And you've got the fact that, I think that happens a lot for people who, value the lives of animals, that are often, dismissed and said that, nah, that's too sensitive. What does it matter? It's only an animal. And certainly if you were talking about plants, right, which this book makes you, and makes you feel very guilty for any time that you haven't respected a plant, but in that way that sort of acknowledges that you're a flawed human being, and that's fair enough. But maybe, if you were to think about it, it's an interesting thing to ponder. But so A, sort of that, but then B, just to any situation. When someone, and certainly a parent or anything, says that you're too sensitive because you care about X, Y, Z, that, that hurts. So I don't know, that moment really stuck out for me and sort of, ties with how he feels about the animals and the things that happen to them. Like we were just talking about the parallels between the both intentional and unintentional widespread deaths of animals across the story, obviously connected to that civil war and various things like that, is all just so cleverly written. I really don't understand how she so cleverly interweaves all those different things, but I'm very grateful for it.
Yeah, I mean, just on that, this is a book heavy with death and pain and like really, really kind of like heady things. So don't go into this thinking it's like a light read. It's definitely not.
No.
There are going to be things that gonna like tug on your heartstrings and make you feel really sad and mad and upset about things. But that's what good books do. Yeah. Sometimes. The last note that I've got on my thing, because I think we've pretty much covered everything else, is there is a section where they go to basically an Islamic witch doctor, and like this is, I know maybe like the Turkish in Turkish culture, it might be a bit different, but this is like, I'm a fairly practicing Muslim, and this is such a big. It really put me on like tenterhooks because I've heard so many bad stories about things that have happened to people that go to those kind of like magicians or whatever you want to call them. So, and it's really, and it's interesting for me because I think this is the first book that I've read where that's in there.
Yeah.
So yeah, but like for me, that was actually one of the scariest bits of the book because I wasn't sure. Are they going to be walking into like an abusive situation, something like that? So right. Yeah, I mean, you hear a lot of bad stories about that sort of thing. So yeah, so that's just the other thing that I wanted to kind of mention quickly. Yeah. Anything else that you wanted to talk about?
Yeah, and I'll try and not say too much because I really could just talk about this for ages. And please, if literally anything has piqued your interest from this review, please do go and listen to it. I do think it's fabulous. But as Fahad said, when you're in a place that you can handle the dark things, because it is deep and it is dark, but it is so worth it. And there is so much hope and brightness in there as well. So as long as you're at a point where you can handle, listening to something deep, then I fully recommend it. It is fantastic. I'm going to add actually a few more tiny criticisms that I had. Again, audio version stuff. I was pretty sure that Daphne, maybe understandably because her name being Daphne, did often call Daphne. Yeah. And there was a mix between kind of Defne, and Defne, and things like that. And that did irritate me slightly. It's just a continuity thing, but still doesn't overshadow how amazing the performance was. Just a slight niggly thing from me. And then I will not go into this deeply because I do not want spoilers, but I would be interested to talk to you afterwards. And certainly if anyone listening wants to chat with me about it, I'd be interested because I'm hard to please with endings. And the sort of the rounding up ending of this, I thought was fabulous. And it nearly made me cry on the train. But the actual ending, I'm not sure it worked retrospectively. Like, there's sort of a twist bit, and I don't really know that it tracks for the rest of it.
I know what you're talking about. Yeah. I think I could have done without it.
But I love the sentiment behind it so much that I don't mind.
Yeah.
But I'll be honest, for me, I said this to my partner, I don't accept it as canon. I like it as a sentimental fanfic maybe, but I don't accept it as canon. As the very, very ending. But I would be intrigued to see what other people think. I'm just, not sure it tracks with the rest of it. But it still was a beautiful ending. And so, what I will finish up with is very much tied to what you were saying in your roundup, in that it really does pull at your heartstrings, and I was really struggling to put into words what I felt like it did to me. And I don't really want to say that it smashed it to pieces because that doesn't feel like the right kind of action, but it's sort of like maybe it like poked it really hard and like bruised it and shook it about maybe. I don't know, but kind of the most important thing was that it had my heart.
Yeah.
You know, it just like stole it from my chest and just held on to it and was like, yeah, I'm going to keep this while you're listening and probably for a while after. It felt that sort of, it's out of my chest. You just have to surrender to this book, I think. And even the sad bits, you know, I don't think this one actually made tears happen, because it was a different kind of sadness. It was very much an in my chest sadness, but also a warmth in there, and just, surrender to this book, love it, and then come talk to us about it and recommend it to everyone.
I'd agree with that. It's a really beautiful, really beautifully written book that's been like exquisitely performed. So that's a really highly recommended for me. I think maybe one of the best books I've listened to.
I think for me too. I'm glad you agree, but definitely up there for me. Yeah, for sure.
Cool. So we haven't decided what book we're going to be doing next. We'll let you guys know via social media. If you can continue to support the podcast by leaving a review or rating wherever you found us. You can leave a tip in the tip jar. There's a link in the episode description. If you've got any recommendations or comments that you'd like to send us, you can contact us over social media at audiobookishpod or email us at audiobookishpod@gmail.com. Should we say bye, Poppy?
Bye, guys.
Bye.